And hello to everyone who is joining us online today. My name is Duncan Depledge from Loughborough University in the United Kingdom, and it's my pleasure to be opening the second day of the CSAT conference by chairing a fantastic panel of speakers who will be discussing military spending and carbon emissions. The context for the discussion is quite simply this. Defence has a carbon problem, by which I mean the vast quantities of fossil fuels that are being burned in the name of national security have become increasingly difficult to ignore. And even though international order has been ruptured, global peacefulness is in decline, and rearmament is proceeding apace, we simply cannot afford in planetary terms to not take seriously the need to acknowledge, account for, and understand the implications of trying to solve national and international security problems by just burning more and more fossil fuels. So to help us think in a bit more detail about these issues, I'm delighted to welcome four speakers who are very much at the leading edge of efforts to account for the carbon costs of preparing for, fighting and rebuilding after war. First, we have Ellie Kinney from the Conflict and Environment Observatory. Second, we have Professor Andrew Jorgenson from the Department of Sociology at the University of British Columbia. Joining us virtually, we have Lennard de Klerk, who leads the initiative on greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas accounting for war. And last but not least, Professor Gregory from the Department of Sociology at McMaster University. Each speaker is going to have around about 12 minutes, after which we'll have a short chair discussion before opening up to questions from the audience. But to begin with, which slides have we got available?
They have mine.
Everyone else, okay. Could you put Andrew's slides up then, please?
I'm usually reluctant to use these since I tend to talk pretty loudly, so I apologize ahead of time. I'll try to do a good job with my self-awareness on this. So good morning, everyone. I guess I'm going first. This has been a great experience. I learned a lot yesterday. It's very rare to go to a conference where everyone in the room has this kind of shared interest in this broad topic, and so grateful for the opportunity to be here, learning a lot from the conversations. And I'm going to time myself because I have a lot to say, and I'm going to make it sure I only talk for 12 minutes. Okay, so I don't have a background in security studies. I'm a macro-sociologist, and I've been studying the anthropogenic drivers of climate change for 25 years. If you're not familiar with this body of work, it's interdisciplinary social science, where we analyze social and environmental data using statistical modeling techniques at multiple scales, trying to understand the structural drivers of greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption. For me, my units of analysis and my work range from power plants to provinces and U.S. states and nation states. And today I'm going to focus on research at the nation-state level for large samples of nations. So in this work that I and my current and former graduate students do in my lab at UBC, we're largely influenced by big thinkers in macro-sociology and adjacent fields focusing on power in the interstate system. So some of you probably recognize some of these big thinker names up here on the board. We've also been largely influenced by the work of Netta and Greg and others on this panel. But we're really largely focusing on the role of coercive power in the interstate system and how it shapes directly and indirectly differences in growth rates for carbon emissions in nations in the global north relative to the global south. I would mention that Jeffrey Kenter here on the right is one of my longtime collaborators in this research, and Christopher Chase Dunn is my academic father and longtime mentor as well. So it's kind of an academic family affair, generational family affair in a sense. So what I'm going to do, which is often risky, is rather than presenting one paper, I'm going to give you a high-level kind of overview of some key findings from a series of recent studies that we've done. This is sort of the most recent iteration of this work. I think the first paper we published on this topic was a little bit over 20 years ago, but this is our most current stuff, and it also serves as the foundation for a book that we have under contract with Columbia University Press, not University of British Columbia, but Columbia University Press. And these are the three kind of key takeaway points in this research that we think are from these studies that are very interrelated, that we think are helping us to build a kind of a rather compelling story on what's been going on in the interstate system over the last 30 plus years. So in this work, I've heard a lot of mention of military expenditures as percent of GDP in the last yesterday, which I understand for good reason. We focus on that for all sorts of geopolitical reasons, and clearly in academic research literature, that's been a primary independent variable of interest for a very long time. In this body of work, my colleagues and I take a slightly different approach, and we focus on the capital intensiveness and relative size of national militaries, where we operationalize these as military expenditures per soldier as our capital intensive measure, and then relative size as military participation rate. We do this for a variety of theoretical and substantive reasons, and also, frankly, because they're very weakly correlated. They're correlated at almost zero in our data sets. So they're capturing rather broad and distinct characteristics of national level militarization. We also look at expenditures as percent of GDP, like many others do. If you're curious, that measure at the national level compared to these two measures are all kind of moderately correlated, but these two are very weakly correlated, and they're really capturing very different broad, distinct characteristics of national militarization. We think, or we've argued for quite some time that they do, and others tend to agree, or at least buy our arguments or they're polite and nod their head and say, okay, sure. But we use the same data that other folks use, using CPRE's data and data from the World Bank. For those of you that are interested in modeling techniques, everything I'm going to report today is a result of autoregressive distributive lag models, which is a pretty standard technique in econometrics with fixed effects. We torture, no pun intended, but we really torture the heck out of these data to look at these empirical relationships, lots of sensitivity analyses and control variables. And I do want to get out of the way right up front, too. There are no outlier cases, because often when I talk about this work with others, they're always like, this is just largely driven by the US, right? Like you take the US out of your data set and your findings completely change. And the short answer is no. We've actually looked very closely at this, and we have no outlier nations in our data sets. Happy to elaborate on any of that. Okay, so I'm sorry that these slides are a little small, but I will tell you that I'm not going to put any tables, regression model tables up on the slide. But this slide here is reporting two things. So you see these two figures here that look quite similar to one another, and the one on the left is reporting the immediate and the long-run estimated effects of military expenditures per soldier on the total carbon emissions of nations for a large sample of nations from 1990 to 2020. On the right side, it's looking at the short-run and long-run effects of military participation rate. So you can say they look very similar, okay? And you see that there's an immediate effect. These are elasticity coefficients, and so that very first bar to the left would be the immediate effect in year one, where you have a 1% increase in your independent variable leads to a fill-in-the-blank percent increase in the dependent variable. They're both significantly different than zero. They're small, but if you look at the cumulative and long-run effects that are reported, within these bar charts, and I have a feeling this doesn't surprise anyone in this room, but you see that there are non-trivial cumulative and long-run effects of both of these militarization characteristics on national level carbon emissions. And I should note that this is production-based CO2 data. We're not looking at consumption-based CO2 data in this particular series of analyses, and we have particular reasons for that. And we treat these as very similar effects, since the confidence intervals are overlapping for these two variables. So we think it's quite telling that these two very distinct characteristics of national militarization have very similar short-run and long-run effects on nations' carbon emissions. And these effects are not trivial. So if we do some back-of-the-envelope calculations, which we've kind of summarized in the bottom left-hand corner here, you can see that combined for this sample of over 100 nations, that a 1% increase in either of these two variables would lead to, in the long run, a cumulative increase in their overall emissions. It's on par roughly with what the United States as a whole emitted in the year 2020. So these are not trivial effects, okay? If you're wondering what are the causal mechanisms, please read the papers. They're very complicated, in-depth theoretical stories and historical stories about geopolitics. And I'm sitting in a room of experts on these topics, and so I think you could probably imagine the various pathways through which these relationships are occurring. We'd love to get your feedback and thoughts on this too. But one of the ways in which we think this mechanism is occurring is through how militarization is shaping the effects of economic growth on carbon emissions. So this study here was published in the American Sociological Review, which is my discipline's flagship journal, where we look at how these two militarization characteristics might amplify the effects of economic growth on carbon emissions of nations? And the shorter answer is yes, they both do. This figure here is plotting out the estimated effects of GDP per capita on per capita carbon emissions for nations at the 10th percentile, the median, and the 90th percentile of each of these militarization characteristics. And so if you go from left to right, you see a clear story here, where for nations that tend to have higher levels of both of these two militarization characteristics, the estimated effect of economic growth on per capita emissions is bigger. And so, well, I should note that I've been involved in the major debates about decoupling for a very long time in the climate social science literature about how might we be able to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions. This research suggests that at least historically, militarization hasn't been a mechanism through decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions. In fact, at least up to the current point, it's doing the opposite. What are the explanations for this? Again, we're really building on long-standing traditions, looking at kind of the permanent war economy and the global military-industrial complex. Again, I'm sitting in a room full of experts, on-the-ground experts on these topics, and so I think you could kind of think about what the different causal mechanisms are. And if not, also read some of the papers that Greg Hooks published decades ago on this topic if you want to get some good ideas on this. If you're wondering, though, how non-trivial these effects are, if we take this analysis and we look at hypothetical scenarios, counterfactual analysis of what would a hypothetical world of high militarization look like versus low militarization versus what's happened. So this middle line here represents just the average per capita GDP, per capita emissions in our data set. Okay, so that's what we observe just in our data set. The upper dot here, dotted line here, represents what would happen in a hypothetical world of high militarization based upon our analysis and our equation. The lower dot here, lower dotted line, represents what would happen in a hypothetical world of low militarization, which again kind of highlights the non-trivial effects of how militarization has been moderating or increasing the effects of economic growth on carbon emissions. And if you're wondering, yes, this is the result of a three-way statistical interaction in our analysis. Okay, and so finally, this is probably the most controversial thing that we've been looking at because we're engaging in these critical areas of social science on environmental load displacement within the world economy, but we're also engaging in long-standing debates within economics and sociology on the effects of foreign investment on the environment, where we make an intervention here where we suggest that we should be looking at where does foreign investment come from, like who are the sending nations and what are their characteristics. And so what we do here is we look at the extent to which inward foreign investment coming from more militarily powerful nations might affect carbon emissions of nations within the global south, okay? And we hypothesize that this is going to have a positive effect on growth in their emissions, independent of the effects of overall just levels of foreign investment. So this is really about, it matters where the foreign investment is coming from, not just how much foreign investment you're getting. So what we find is that this does have a small but non-trivial effect on growth in emissions in global south nations, short-run and long-run effects, independent of all the other usual anthropogenic drivers that we've all been interrogating for decades. These effects are not huge, but they're not trivial. And again, we think that this is another way through which overall militarization is shaping the carbon emissions of nations. Okay. I realize I just ran through a whole lot of stuff really quickly and really early, and it's been raining, but just, again, this work, we find that both the capital intensiveness and relative size of militaries, national militaries, is increasing the carbon emissions of nations. Further, we find that the effect of economic growth on carbon emissions is greater for nations that have relatively high militarization in the context of military expenditures per soldier and military participation rate. And finally, we find that capital-intensive militarization, to some extent, is partially shaping carbon load displacement from the global north to the global south. And again, this kind of quantitative empirical work, again, I know it's really high level, really macro level stuff, but this is serving as kind of the empirical foundation for a book that we have under contract where we're going to be including some in-depth case studies to really drill down on the underlying mechanisms that get at this. So I think I'm at time, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Have we got Ellie's slides now?
I can give a little bit of an introduction to. So, as mentioned, I'm with the, hey, look at that, thank you. I'm with the Conflict and Environment Observatory. So we are a small but mighty NGO based in the north of England, where it also rains a lot, so it feels like I'm at home. And I coordinate our project, the Military Emissions Gap. So comes as probably no news to everyone in this room that the world is facing the most violent conflict that it has since World War II. And there's no getting away from the fact that wars are damaging. Physical combat serves to be destructive in nature. And what we're starting to understand now is quite how climate breakdown fits into this, adding to this kind of immediate humanitarian impact that we see on the ground. Speaking from CEOBS' perspective, we've seen a huge increase in attention, specifically kind of media attention, on the climate impacts of conflicts, fueled in part, I suppose, by the availability of data to piece together what has kind of otherwise been quite an unknown. So Lennard's work that you'll hear about for the Initiative on Greenhouse Gas Accounting of War estimates that 4 years of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has contributed the same emissions as France produces in a whole year. Benjamin Naimark out of Queen Mary University of London and colleagues have estimated that Israel's bombardment of Gaza has resulted in 31 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And we've also seen early estimations that the first 14 days of US and Israeli attacks on Iran produced around 5 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And these are just sort of 3 examples of ongoing or very recent conflicts. But it's research that also builds on the kind of absolute foundational work of Nita Crawford and the Costs of War project, examining the climate impact of the US-led invasions after 9/11. And I could easily spend my allocated 12 minutes going on about all of this, and if you find me at lunch, I absolutely will do. But instead, I want to focus a little bit less on kind of this kind of active warfighting conflict situations and more on the sort of the everyday activities of running a military. So we at the Military Emissions Gap set about estimating the emissions from the world's militaries. And we found that in peacetime, so no, not all the figures that I've just said, in peacetime, the world's militaries are responsible for an estimated 5.5% of global emissions. This means that if the world's militaries were a country, it would have the 4th highest carbon footprint, only beaten by China, the US, and India. To put this into perspective, this is more than the entire continent of Africa produces, and more than kind of highly polluting sectors like shipping. But crucially, this is only an estimation. And it's only an estimation because we actually don't know the full scale of the military's contribution to global emissions, because there's actually no obligation for this to be reported anywhere. And this is what we call the military emissions gap. This is the gap between what governments report that their militaries are emitting and the actual true scale of this contribution to climate breakdown. So we have a website, militaryemissions.org, where you can kind of dig into the data that does get submitted to the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which kind of houses international climate action and houses the inventories where governments submit their national emissions. And in a nutshell, kind of no government has to report the emissions from their militaries. So many don't. And those who do don't tend to do it particularly well. So we update this analysis every year, just before COP. And I want to pick out 2 kind of notable updates from last year's analysis. And so if you go on militarymissions.org, this is kind of what you see. There's a map. You can click on your country, and you can see what is listed within the UNFCCC reporting. You can see what we perceive as the gap in emissions reporting. You can see data accessibility scores. Have a dig around on that. But yeah, you can see here 2 particularly notable changes, which is that both the US and China now report absolutely nothing from their military emissions. So the US stopped reporting altogether, Thank you for that. China used to report a kind of sort of tokenistic, I would say, amount of military missions, and that there was something got reported every year, but that figure didn't change, so it's a bit iffy. But now their military missions are listed as not occurring, which doesn't feel massively likely to me. So that is just under half of the world's military spending, that's 45%, that is not represented in climate data and is completely missing from our analysis. And that the rest of that, I mean, the rest of the picture of global military missions is patchy, it's incomplete, or again, it's just missing. And I want to go back a little bit to why this is the case, have a little bit of a history lesson. So take us back to Kyoto, 1997. We are negotiating for the Kyoto Protocol. It's the predecessor to the Paris Agreement. It's the first greenhouse gas tracking and reduction mechanism. Now, the US said they wouldn't sign up unless militaries were specifically exempt from reporting obligations. So military exemptions were written into the Kyoto Protocol. The US never ratified the treaty anyway. But you can read the government memos from this time, that really interesting. And the DoD and kind of government representatives were fully aware that the Pentagon is the largest energy consumer within federal government. And this is a pattern that you see across other governments. We heard about it yesterday. Same with Canada, the majority of the government's emissions. The UK is same, it's over half of central government's emissions. But the US were adamant that military emissions reporting would become a security concern, that it would be far too difficult to calculate, and that operations would risk being compromised. So fast forward to the Paris Agreement, and this exemption was lifted, but it wasn't replaced with any meaningful obligation to report. It remains voluntary with these kind of sort of weak voluntary guidelines. And what we see is this kind of culture of military exceptionalism starting from that moment in Kyoto and potentially earlier, which sort of permeates throughout the UNFCCC, but out into climate and environmental policy that we see on an EU level and national levels as well. And to this day, this concern around national security that was kind of pedaled back in Kyoto, that still gets highlighted, and I'm not massively convinced. So there's a blog on our website, which is written by a former colleague of mine, Lindsay Cottrell, and she digs into and kind of debunks a lot of the main points around security concerns. So I thought I'd share this and kind of dig into it a little bit, and I'd be curious to get people's response, maybe in the discussion later on, and see how this lands with you. And I'm specifically going to talk about the security concerns around reporting, not the security concerns about reductions, because I think this will come up later. So I think, a starting point for me with this is kind of UNFCCC data, so data that gets reported by governments to the UNFCCC. It runs 2 years behind. So the latest data that you find on our website gets taken every year from the UNFCCC. So, for example, last year's data submitted in 2025, but it's emissions data from 2023. And this kind of 2 years out of date data is still useful for climate action. But I would really question how useful it is in terms of security intelligence. And what Lindsay points out in this blog is that there's a lot of other military data that is much more readily available and probably much more useful and a lot more up to date. And this is things like military spending data, AIS tracking of military aircrafts, military structures, military strategies, equipment profiles, personnel numbers, military contract awards, all of this kind of readily available information, either readily available or through Freedom of Information requests. And for a lot of these examples, they're transparent for a reason, and because it could be attempts to make government decision-making more transparent, or to collect useful data on a kind of multilateral level like we do with military spending. And I think, in particular, one of the key arguments why this kind of national security excuse, if I can call it an excuse, doesn't hold up anymore is that some militaries are already reporting. While the state of reporting is really poor internationally, there are some governments who are reporting more comprehensively and detailed. I'll say it is a minority, but they are out there, like Norway and increasingly Slovenia, which goes to show that this is possible. Because the conversation is sort of shifted in international forums too. Over the last kind of couple of years, we've seen NATO publish its own greenhouse gas reporting methodology. It wasn't amazing, but it was a step in the right direction. We saw European Parliament pass a resolution just before COP28, which called for transparent reporting of military missions to the UNFCCC. It also called for EU member states to ensure that military greenhouse gas emissions were included in domestic net zero targets. And this echoes policies that are already promoted by the European Commission. But I won't lie, the progress that we've made here does feel a little fragile at this moment. We've seen climate change slipping down NATO's agenda since the start of Trump 2.0, and across NATO and across the EU, with kind of this transparency in institutions as well as kind of climate policy on the whole feels like it's under threat. And that was meant to be for that slide, but there we go. And this is happening at a very concerning time. I don't need to tell you all this. We know this. We know the statistics. We've heard it yesterday, and you'll also hear a little bit more from Lennard too, I know, that the commitments to raise military spending, whether through Rearm Europe or NATO's increase to 5%, is going to push military emissions higher. And transparent reporting is fundamental, firstly, in understanding the kind of the scale of what we're facing here, and secondly, to do something about it. You just fundamentally can't manage what you don't measure, and we need to be really clear here that militaries can't be exempt from climate action, because climate breakdown isn't going to wait until it's back in political favour to talk about climate change in NATO again, and we need a whole of society approach to emissions reductions, and that means that the military does have a role to play. And as part of this, what we really need are advocates for transparency within militaries and the institutions that surround them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ellie. We're going to turn now to Lennard, who is joining us online. So if we can bring Lennard up on the screen. Hello, Lennard. We can see you.
Great. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. And sorry I couldn't be there in person. On the other hand, I did save or avoided 2 tons of CO2 for my transatlantic flight. And just for your information, the sun is shining here and it's a nice 30 degrees. Many things were already said before, but we've been looking into military missions and the relations between increased defense spending and military missions. But before I start, I will just give you a little bit of context. Ellie already mentioned some of the numbers that you see here. The reason why I show it again is to make sure that we're talking about 2 different things. When we're talking about conflict emissions, we're not only talking about emissions of warfare, but we also are talking about emissions from different sources like forest fires or future emissions for the reconstruction of everything that has been destroyed. And as you, for example, can imagine in Gaza, relatively about 80% of the buildings have been destroyed, so reconstruction emissions will be very significant. Iran, we only have a 2 weeks quick assessment. We're currently working on getting the numbers right there for the full period until the ceasefire. Please bear with us. We need still a couple of weeks to get the new numbers. Military missions, so these are what we sort of define are the military missions during peacetime, or as you can also say, preparing for war or providing deterrence as a service, is actually much bigger. As you can see, and Ellie already mentioned, the best estimate that we have, it's 5.5% of world total. So if you compare the 2 numbers, actually you see that if we are want to look in mitigation, we should actually not so much focus on how we can avoid conflict emissions, other than avoiding the conflict in itself, but focus on the military emissions during peacetime. We are seeing now that average military spending is 2.5% of GDP in 2025, and it's set to increase significantly in the decade to come. We know the targets of NATO, and in that sense, NATO and the member states are very transparent, or in its military spending reporting. For other countries, it's very difficult to predict, what they will be spending in the future. But what we observed is that in the whole, climate policies and the discussions, these military emissions and decrease as a result of this military spending is not being discussed and is not taken into account. So what we have done is trying to model the impact of the increased and the military spending escalations on global greenhouse gas emissions. It is an article that is currently under a review, so we hope to be able to publish a peer-reviewed final version after summer, but I can already share some of the intermediate results. And basically what we've done is we've modeled using different military expenditure scenarios, ranging from keeping at 2.5%, going to 3.5%, or even escalating to 5%. We also have different decarbonization rates for both the military and the civil sector separately, different GDP growth rates, and then also we have a so-called elasticity of emissions to military burdens, because we do expect that increased military spending will also crowd out financing for mitigation efforts in the civil society. And actually, I'll just show you one scenario, which is NATO going to 3.5% and the other countries going to 3.5% as well. So we are increasing military spending with 1 percentage point. And then you can see here for different military decarbonization rates, DM, how the share of global the share of military emissions of the global greenhouse gas emissions is developing, using 5.5% as a starting point. And here you can see that the share of military emissions actually in 10 years' time could increase to over 10%, going to 11%, unless we see very strong decarbonization rates of 7% per year. The other one aspect that we looked into is how much of the military emissions will use up the remaining carbon budget that remains here to keep the 1.5% to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And similar here, you see that if we don't have strong decarbonization rates, then actually the military sector alone will use up the carbon budget completely by 2050. And if you understand that currently the military sector is only responsible for 5.5%, that means that it's very surprising to see that the military sector will use up the remaining carbon budget. Of course, you can argue that keeping the temperature increase to 1.5% is already something that is probably not achievable anymore. But even if we look at the 2 degree carbon budget, then the military sector will actually consume 25 to 27% of the remaining carbon budget. So here are our preliminary conclusions. The military emissions, maybe not a surprise, but we at least were able to quantify it, will increase substantially, both in absolute and relative terms. It will consume a large part of the remaining carbon budget that's still available. And only the high military decarbonization rates can offset military burdens. So if we are talking about about emission pathways, then we can simply not ignore military emissions and military spending in modeling, in trying to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that is to become carbon neutral also by 2050. I do hope that Greg in the next presentation will be actually be able to present some solutions to this. That brings me to the end. Here are my contact details, and if you would like to read our latest report on 4 years of war in Ukraine and the conflict emissions, please scan this QR code. Okay, thank you. Back to you, Duncan.
Thank you very much for that, Lennard. Okay, so now we'll turn to our final speaker on the panel, Professor Greg Hooks.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming out on this rainy morning and drying off with these fans, so that's all good. And thanks, everyone. You'll see, hopefully you can read it, but this is based on a relatively large collaboration. Lennard's one of the contributors, so if I don't come up with solutions in my talk, apparently Lennard will be disappointed. But I think some of you know Karen and Anselm, who was here last year at this, but I think you know him from other venues. But anyway, so we had a conversation about this at CSAC last year about laying out a policy at a broad level, laying out some policy alternatives that it might help to step back and look at the options at a broader level. So that's what we're trying to do here. So we're making the case that NATO has choices. NATO and member states, obviously, has choices in a rearmament pathways. We spell out what we see as the context for that, and then in the discussion, we won't. By the way, there's a lot going on in this paper, and there's quite a few contributors, and Duncan here is only giving me 12 minutes, so there'll be a lot left out, and so we'll bring that up in discussion. So I'll try not to blame my co-authors if your questions are really pointed about something that's omitted or obtuse thinking in all of this. So we believe that this rearmament, looking back in 25, 50 years, it'll look like a big choice, that somebody made a big choice even though it's a big messy world and it doesn't feel like it. And I'll add some details, but one choice is to reinforce carbon lock-in of military forces. The second one is actually to live up to the NATO's climate change plan, which was put out shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine. So there's a whole question mark as to whether NATO can, quote unquote, afford to actually live up to this plan or not. And it's as a diplomatic cooperative arrangement, NATO, it's actually what will individual nation states do in all of this. And then the last one is that NATO has the option, doesn't feel like it probably, but to escape carbon lock-in, that's what the rearmament does, that it has an intention to do that. So I don't think we've talked about this in various ways here, but the option number one is carbon lock-in. We were talking about procurement yesterday. This is buying off the shelf. If NATO buys off the shelf, basically they're buying fossil fuel intensive armaments. And that'll be linked to the force structures and in the way wars are fought and all sorts of other things. And so this is just buying off the shelf, basically, with slight modifications. The second one doesn't really change that about the actual weapons. I mean, the NATO's climate plan is fairly assertive about decarbonizing bases and vehicles and things like that. It's not silent on it, but in terms of expectations, I think it's rather oblique on whether or not it'll decarbonize weapons and fighting structures and things like that. But one thing NATO does commit itself to is to be more transparent with regards to the points that Ellie was making. This plan does suggest that NATO and NATO member states will be more disclosive than the Paris Accords would obligate them to. we believe, since there's not much time, we believe that that would have the effect of carbon lock-in, that the forces that are channeling military towards carbon intensity wouldn't be dislodged by following that plan. And then the third one is that the third option is actually to have decarbonization as a goal. It's a lot of money. And so we believe that that would be a possibility, that NATO could choose, and it wouldn't be an easy choice, I understand that, but NATO could choose to use this relatively large infusion to do something about climate change. Instead, again, Andrew's modeling and Lennard's modeling, they basically assume that a dollar spent on the military is going to have this consequence for carbon output. And so this third one says, well, we're going to try to change the curve. We're going to try to make Andrew wrong. Right.
Make me wrong.
So our thinking is informed by, for political scientists and social scientists, historical institutionalism and neo-Keynesianism. And the idea is that if you can imagine you're out for a hike and you come to a fork in the road, that was the reason I had that picture there, and you go left or right, it doesn't seem like a big deal. You can always go down 20 paces and say, oh, that's a mistake, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But the further you go down the path, the advantages of continuing down the path are higher, the benefits, and the costs of getting off that path are higher. And that's inertia. And George Unruh, who I find very informative on these topics, has written on, and he's not talking about the military, he's just talking about the inertia of a fossil fuel intensive industrial institutional system. And I won't read the quote there. Hopefully the print's not too small. But his point is that the military's current carbon intensity grew up alongside a civilian sector that was carbon intensive, an entire world that ships petroleum, stores it, know what to do with it, has the human capital to fix an engine or build a new one or design a new one. So the idea, and universities contribute to this, governments depend upon it, all sorts of things. And so the idea that you're just going to take one little piece out and fix it is nonsense. And so he talks about this enormous inertia that comes from a large, integrated, global now, techno-institutional complex. And Duncan has, I didn't even ask if you actually read it, I think, but we kind of agree on this, that this is Duncan writing about the enormous inertia that military forces play. Because you've got entire force structures, you've got weapons sitting, you've got jets sitting in hangars, you've got doctrines for how to fight wars, you've got everything in place to rely on fossil fuel intensive militaries. And it's extraordinarily dangerous if you're in a shooting war to say, I think I'm going to do it a different way now, right? And so that inertia, and again, going back to UNRWA, it's not like the military can look over its shoulder and have a civilian sector, certainly not in 1970 or 1980 or 1990 or the turn of the century, and say, do you have any solutions for us? Because it's a large, integrated, codependent, and path-dependent complex. So that's the inertia. In fact, we believe the inertia is so strong that there probably will not be an internal mechanism that would disrupt it. It's hard to imagine an internal dynamic that would say, okay, we're going to do something different. So we introduced the notion of shocks. Is it possible that this entire system could be subjected to some shocks? And this is hardly comprehensive, but we're going to give two examples, one involving Russia, one involving the United States. You could do the drone revolution. You could go on a long list. I've only got 12 minutes. But what's interesting about Russia, we think, in terms of fossil fuels, is that both the United States and Russia are the former superpowers, but they were superpowers in a techno-institutional system that relied on fossil fuels, and they're both exporters, and they're both a couple of the worst actors in the world in general on climate issues and on fossil fuels. And they using Carney's thing about using the global system as a weapon instead as providing benefits, they're both basically bullying people over petroleum right now. And so Russia thought that it could overwhelm using fossil fuel intensive and much larger manpower. You know this better than I do, I'm sure. And they also thought they could bully Western Europe because they depended upon fossil fuels. And so they thought they could collapse Ukraine in a matter of weeks, and that Europe would basically have to wring its hands and accept the fait accompli on the ground. And instead, some 4 years later, having suffered millions of casualties, I don't need to go through all the lists of what a disaster this has been. You have Ukraine systematically showing how dangerous it can be to rely on fossil fuels. And my guess is the kinetic energy in a fossil fuel depot is only going to become a bigger and bigger liability over time. The other thing is that Western Europe has rapidly found other sources of energy, including green sources. And so I like this paper that called Putin the Green, that he had the ironic effect of pushing a change towards renewables. And the United States, having watched Russia do that, said, I know what we'll do. How about we attack somebody out of the blue who's sitting on the Strait of Hormuz? That's what we'll do. That's really clever. So they did that. And they assumed that they could cause the collapse of the Iranian regime, and they couldn't do anything about it. But of course, if you've read the newspaper in the last month or so, you know that Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. And with that, 20% of the world's oil, and I think upwards of 50% of the helium. I can't keep track of all the things that are bottled up behind the Strait of Hormuz. But I think the technical term for this is a complete disaster for the United States. And so they're trying to buy their way out of it and pretending like they've got a solution. But, and so I'm wondering whether we will call Donald the eco-warrior, because there's been a rapid shift towards trying to say, okay, we don't want to be dependent upon these global flows. And there has been some, at least rhetorically, a pretty big shift towards green alternatives. So, and the other one is, I wanted to bring up, and this has to do with the exemption of the military from reporting. That is only true with regard to these COPs and the UN mandates. Countries around the world are saying we're going to be carbon neutral by 2040, 2050. When you read those things, there's not a carve out for the military. And so if a national government's going to be at carbon neutral and they've got a military, that's a real question as to what, if and how there will be a carve out just because the COP Accord said that. And the other thing is the International Court of Justice has a statement about the responsibilities of states in a climate emergency, and they do not have a carve out for the military. So the question is whether or not the military is going to be facing a shock externally in various legal and political realms where they're saying, no, you can't do that anymore. That's not legal. We won't fund it. We won't give this. We won't do that. So there could be some external shocks to the system. Now, again, part of this has to do with an entire civilian decarbonization, and that's well beyond the scope of time. But I do think that this poses a question about what is the likelihood that a carbon-intensive jet bought in the 2020s will be a stranded asset by 2035. 2045, 2055, long before its anticipated service is over. What is the possibility it'll be what's called a stranded asset, right? That and everything that takes care of it. So it's actually, and then there's possibilities. So this would not be the first time that the military transitioned its energy sources. And so at the dawn of the 20th century, the world's great navies relied on coal, which meant that they had to, in imperial fashion, have coal yards all around the world. They had to have a very labor-intensive labor force to load ships because it wasn't automated. So they had to be shipping coal, storing coal, getting coal thing. And one thing that was bad about coal is you actually had to go to port to get refueled, right? So there was a number of strategic disadvantages to coal, right? And so here's Winston Churchill, who was, what was his title? He was the First Lord of the Admiralty at that time in the early 20th century. And he said, although the advantages conferred by liquid fuel were inestimable, to change the foundation of the Navy from British coal to foreign oil was a formidable decision in itself. And he was talking about the inertia of coal. That is, you've got all of these investments in coal yards around the world and everything that goes with it, and we're going to throw that out the window. And they did, which led to an imperial race for petroleum, which had a lot to do, if you read through some of the histories of why Nazi Germany made mistakes in the East, it had to do with oil. Why did the Japanese attack the Americans? It had to do with oil, right? So petroleum had become the critical resource by World War II. And this meant, when they made this shift, by World War II, it was almost all petroleum-based. That meant that there were stranded assets of a previous military infrastructure all over the world. Ships that couldn't work. You had coal yards that were abandoned, of course, but then they had to build out something new on a global scale. And the military is not responsible for a fossil fuel intensive techno-institutional system using UNRWA, but the military actually bankrolled a big chunk of the global infrastructure and needed to supply a global military force. So what are the possibilities? And again, here are drawing heavily on work by Mazzucata and collaborators. Okay, so basically she makes the point about mission-oriented rearmament, and she talks about these things, and I just wanted to point out that the military has deflected the technological curve in recent times, and the collective investment by NATO is enormous. And one of the points I'd want to make is that the smartphone, right, and the IT revolution was bankrolled by the military, and deliberately so. It made a choice. And the United States military and NASA consumed almost 100% of all the semiconductors in the world into the 1970s, when you started seeing handheld calculators, if you're old enough to have done so, right? That was entirely done, and the things that make smartphones smart were bankrolled and directed by military, and then commercialized. So the question is not if NATO rearmament has the potential to accelerate the energy transition. It does. The question is if NATO will choose to do so, not to make that sound easy. And so if I had 12 minutes, I'm not going to pretend to predict the future, but Duncan says I don't have time to predict the future. So I'll leave that for questions.
You don't want to be predicting the future. Risky business. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for those presentations. We've got just over half an hour left of the panel, so I'll keep my own questions short and then invite people to contribute from the audience. But I wonder if I could just turn to Lennard and Ellie first and ask you for your kind of reflections on how you think the work that you are doing is landing in terms of who is interested in this, who is engaging with it, who isn't, and who needs to be.
A lot of questions in there. So who was interested? Trying to say all the questions again. What were the first?
Yeah, I mean, so the question is about
How is it landing?
Yeah, how's it landing? I mean, who is engaging with what you're doing and who isn't, and are those things matched up with who needs to be?
Yeah, I think so. There is definitely within. So a lot of my work is focused around the UNFCCC. Where we see the most interest in this, I suppose, is probably more in the, Ukraine, for example, has been a real real front runner in bringing conflict emissions as a topic to COP. But as we said, and as Lennard said, this is different to the topic of bringing military emissions on the whole. And this remains, I think we're kind of yet to see anyone really take up the broader topic of military emissions and really push it. I think we've worked with as mentioned, like Norway and Slovenia on this, I'd say, are some of the kind of the key governments, at least on a UNFCCC level, who are working on this. But there's I think if we match up the level of progress and kind of push with what is needed, I think we're just nowhere near where it needs to be. However, what I do see within this, and I think what I'm kind of my calls for sort of optimism within this, if I'm allowed to have that working in climate world, is looking to the sort of evolving process around transitioning away from fossil fuels, which kicked off in Santa Marta April of this year, and kind of looking at what these kind of just how societies transition away from fossil fuels and making sure that these kind of exemptions that exist within UNFCCC policy cannot exist in other places. And I think we kind of are seeing a bit more interest in that of what this kind of fully transitioned societies look like. Leonard, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I can for sure add. Indeed, conflicts. Conflict emissions are an easier sell, at least to the public, because it's very relevant. It's in the daily news. Military emissions is because it is not reported. There are so many unknowns. What we at least try to do is to by quantifying military emissions, is that people understand, and policymakers in particular understand, that we have a problem. And we have a problem if we, take off-the-shelf products, then we will never going to meet the 2-degree target of the Paris Agreement. So that's what we are trying to do. But also, I would say pushing for a solution, and one of the solutions that I see is in the NATO target, we do have this 3.5% plus 1.5% for spending in infrastructure, and that could actually be the key to to increase the decarbonization rate. And you see the discussion already, not maybe so much from a climate perspective, but more from an energy resilience perspective on how can we reduce our dependencies of fossil fuels, but in the end of the day that delivers the same result.
Thank you for those answers. Yeah, go for it.
So I think this is a really great question. I just wanted to share a recent experience sort of along these lines. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the United States National Climate Assessment report. It got a lot of news recently because the fifth, disappeared with the Trump administration, like the website went dark. But anyway, I used to be in the US and I was part of the NCA5, and I was tasked with synthesizing the anthropogenic drivers literature in 800 words. And I made an attempt to include this area of rich empirical research in that, and it got watered down to one very short sentence by the end through all of the processes. And we actually had to fight to keep that one sentence in, and I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. So the other question I had, which I suppose is for all the panel to kind of comment on, in my own experience speaking to defence and military officials about these issues, one of the things that came up time and time again is it's often less a reluctance to report emissions, and it's more a lack of literacy regarding how to do it, because military and defence organisations traditionally don't have the people, the systems to actually do this kind of work. So when we're thinking about solutions, I'm reminded of the work of Anthony King and what he's been doing on AI, and how increasingly militaries, defence organisations are bringing in contractors from the technology sector to come and help them do this work. And I wonder what the parallel potentially is with kind of climate scientists or carbon accountants sort of thing. Is that something that you've thought about, or is that a direction of travel that could work for this? And how do you think militaries and the defence sector might respond?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that, and then maybe Lennard, as resident carbon accountant, could jump in. I think in terms of the kind of hesitancy around emissions reporting, and this idea of it's far too complex for militaries to deal with, I think is a question. I think on one hand, we have seen progress. Sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought. Lennard, do you want to come in, and then I'll let me.
Yeah, sure.
My train of thought.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look into carbon accounting, you have to separate the direct emissions, the scope 1 and 2, from scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 is not that complicated. It's about how much fossil fuel you use, how much energy you consume from the grid. So that's an easy one. The difficult one is scope 3. So that's your upstream and downstream emissions. But here it's the industry that actually has to do the carbon accounting work, not the militaries themselves. So the industry has to tell you, okay, if you buy this fighter jet, it will have these life cycle emissions. and the industry is very well capable of doing it. There are, different protocols. The GHG protocol doing it, and actually already, Airbus is already or has already given it a try to come up with these numbers. So I don't think it would be that difficult for the militaries themselves to start reporting.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, now that my train of thought has returned. Canadian time baffling me. I think, so we did a report back in 2019, I think, or it was looking at 2019 data, which was looking at the level of reporting within the arms manufacturing companies. And I think this is really interesting because you can actually, what we saw is that because of and around this time, 2019, the sort of societal mood around climate action and the societal pressure, the trends around ESG reporting, we did actually see that the arms manufacturers were relatively comprehensive reporting. There was reporting there. Again, like governments, there was work to be done, but it was significantly better than what we were seeing out of government militaries, which shows that the capabilities and know-how is there. There is progress there, and you can kind of have this industry, this sort of research knowledge sharing. I think where the issue with this is now, as with a lot of this topic, is as this falls out of favour, both transparency and climate action, that you then see, and ESG type things, that you now see this being at risk, which kind of comes back to this thing, like Greg's kind of sort of closing remarks of, it's not whether they can do it. Of course they can. It's the political will to do so is quite a large driving factor of this. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah. No, sorry. This is such a great panel, great conference. So I completely agree with what my colleagues have just said. This is something that we've been thinking about in my group for a while too. Just the data and measurements challenges are enormous. I think that's an understatement. In terms of Scope 3 emissions, we think in a very modest way, the kind of methodology that we use in our units of analyses are broadly touching upon the military's impacts on kind of getting their Scope 3 emissions by doing these kind of economy-wide analysis. And if anything, we're probably underestimating the actual fact, but we don't know. It's the same, there's a standard problem here, regardless of your data, your unit of analysis, whether you're doing descriptive stuff or inferential stuff. The data are such a huge challenge. I mean, if you haven't read Netta's book, read Netta's book. I mean, the data are a huge, huge challenge.
Greg, did you have anything? No. Okay. Go on. Len.
But maybe just one comment. I mean, what really would be helpful if we, develop a standardized methodology for military missions reporting. So because now we see that each military is inventing the wheel. And as we've seen in the cement industry and in the steel industry, they've standardized it under the GHG protocol. I think it would be a great action if we can do the same for military activities.
But that actually opens up a whole other question about geography and variation across militaries. And so when you're talking about a kind of a standardization, who's going to be part of that standardization? Because there might be something possible at a NATO level, for example. But how do you get China to participate in that? How do you get Russia to participate in that, or any other country we might think of? And I think this is one of the really interesting things about the military emissions debate, is first of all, it identifies the US as being a really outsized player in all of this, which kind of means, well, are the challenges the same in all the other countries? Is the scale of the issue the same in all the other countries? So how do we, I suppose, get more of that geographical variation into the data? And how significant might that be in terms of the kind of responses that might be developed? That's kind of a thought that you can respond to if you like, rather than a specific question. But before anyone does respond, if anyone in the audience has a question, if you'd like to go to the microphone, I will come to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that just off the cuff, it's just workarounds, that we're trying to figure out how to do this. And so just again, that the data, they are what they are. It would be wonderful to come up with a very comprehensive, integrated, highly collaborative global effort to do this. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I wish it would. And so for us, I know it makes a lot of folks uncomfortable when we're making these cross-national comparisons, but we're trying to account for these major geographical and structural and demographic differences across nations to be able to make these sorts of, kind of general inferences. They're far from perfect, but for us, it's just like a series of workarounds trying to do the best we can, answering these basic yet fundamentally important questions. I should mention, too, I grew up in a Lockheed family. My parents worked for Lockheed Martin.
Number 2 behind Raoul.
Okay, Bismarck?
Yeah, hi. Captain Chaire of the Canadian Army. Quick question for you guys, just trying to pick your brain. Hypothetically, if somebody was looking for a solution, or was working on a solution to make NATO independent of fossil fuels, what would you think, what would you recommend would be the best idea to get strategic buy-in at the political level? Like, how would you go about it?
You're asking the big, important elephant in the room question. I should mention that a few weeks ago, I was hanging out in Vilnius. I spent a lot of time at Vilnius University, hanging out in a room of economists at Vilnius University, and they're looking at me asking this question. It's like, hello, do you know where we are? Do you know where you are? Do you know what we're dealing with? Do you understand our history? I'm like, yeah, and their military spending per GDP is among the highest in NATO. And so this was really the focus of the conversation that we had, and just trying to come up with what are the incentives? What would the incentives be? And and not having a background in security studies or military, but being an interdisciplinary social scientist, I'm thinking, well, just vulnerability, right? Like this is a way to reduce vulnerability during theaters of warfare, more during conflict, but also just less vulnerability in these very large, complex systems. Because clearly, what's happened. I mean, we could be. Current geopolitics shows how highly vulnerable these systems are with what just happened in a strait, right? So it's on the one hand, I think maybe that's an overly simplistic solution, but it seems like it's a very clear solution. But I don't know, how do you operationalize and implement that, realistically? And I think that that's where there's a big disconnect here, to come up with, realistic solutions. Maybe that's not the best word, but solutions that the different stakeholders could agree to, that could really commit to. So, I realize, I acknowledge and I think a lot of us really acknowledge the incredible challenges in making the types of changes that are necessary while balancing the reality of geopolitics. That's my big non-answer.
It's such a good question, though. And yeah, I'm also very much excited for the next panel that I think will dig into this kind of thing. But I think, yeah, completely what you were saying around the sort of here consistently operational effectiveness we have to maintain. We can't compromise that. But I think there are arguments to be made around, the money, the personnel that get harmed or killed in energy supply chains. And I think this kind of buy-in of how we basically the kind of the language and the narrative that makes sense. And this is when I think I realized that me, as someone who is passionate about climate change, quite possibly I'm not the right person to be making these arguments within these military settings. But then this is where it's so important that we have these kind of cross dialogues, so that we are able to learn from each other, and we can learn the language that makes most sense within your settings around higher up and within kind of military decision making, and how we get that strategic buy-in. So it's almost not right back at you, but it'd be useful to have that conversation of what you think that is as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Just add one more.
Yeah.
So I very much appreciate the question. I hope you kind of appreciate the answer. But in terms of getting buy-in for the conversation and so forth like that, I think I'm better at posing some questions based on what was said today as opposed to telling exactly what to do. But one question, and it was on one of my slides, one of the questions I would pose on a regular basis to people making these decisions is, how likely is this to be a stranded asset after we spend all this money? How likely is it that we're going to be replacing it in 10 years because we won't be allowed to fly it or drive it or whatever? So I would pose that question frequently, and I would take the pulse of individual nations. How serious are they about their climate claims of being zero? Because virtually every country has said we're going to be carbon neutral by X date. And how serious are they? And is there any language in there that's exempting the military? And my guess is the more serious they are about being carbon neutral, the less likely it is there's going to be a military carve out. And the more likely it is that this will be a stranded asset. And so those would be the questions I would pose. And finally, and this has to do with the inertia question. If you recall the slides that Lennard had about in a 1.5 degree world, how much of the carbon budget is committed to the military, and the answer is all of it. Think about, one, is that legally going to be possible? But think about what that would mean in terms of how anachronistic and esoteric the military hardware would be. So right now, this came up at CSAC last year. I can't remember who said it, but it was like somebody in the military who was here said, we can't find the technicians to manage an all-electronic battlefield, right? We can find people to keep jets in the air. We know how to do that. We have the human capital to maintain. And this is part of the path dependency of where we are. So militaries know how to ship and store petroleum products. They know how to fix internal combustion engine and so forth, and all kinds of other complex things. And if you snap your fingers, and the people on this panel, we get our wish, and it's not that, think about the enormous logistical demands that puts on the military in a bubble to be suddenly carbon neutral. But if you flip the switch, flip the script a little bit per Lennard's, and if you recall that chart, that means that the military would be carrying the entire cost of maintaining this anachronistic labor force and the training. And you wouldn't have cutting edge research coming out of universities, because that would be like, oh, no, we're not doing that. We're interested in some other stuff. And so the more that the civilian sector shifts towards carbon neutrality, the more these benefits of riding the wave of a fossil fuel dependent techno-institutional complex, the more those costs shift entirely onto the military. And so buying off the shelf gets real expensive in 10 years, right? And so those are the questions I would pose on a regular basis. I don't know where the uptake would be, but my guess is that there would be an entrepreneurial civilian politician who would love that and push that issue. My guess is that there would be people who are concerned about stranded assets, military assets around the world, and the implications over and above having very nasty friends to be dependent upon petrostates in a world where petrostates, this is a prediction, right? Petrostates are going to be less and less popular in the future. And the more and more militaries defending democracy have to do deals with these nasty petrostates, the less the legitimacy of the military will be secure. And so those are all the kinds of questions I would ask. I don't know which ones, if any, would land, but those are the questions I'd be posing.
Yeah. And
Lennard's waiting online. So.
Yeah. So if I just can add, also alluding on what Andrew was saying in Vilnius, and of course, if you're in Ukraine and you talk about climate change, nobody cares. That's not their problem. But in Ukraine, everybody understands after this horrible winter is that energy independence and energy resilience is crucial. Not for climate concerns, but just for reasons of survival. And actually, Russia is currently also getting a lesson from Ukraine that, their country is depending on fossil fuel, which is now very hard hit by the Ukrainians. So also in the current conflicts with the closure of Hormuz, we are seeing that, in a conflict, fossil fuel deliveries is the first target. And if you are not dependent on them anymore, you're much more resilient. And I guess that this will also be a topic in the next panel.
very quick because we've got 2 questions waiting.
Okay, so 2 things. So for one, I just acknowledge that, historically, military R&D, the innovation of the military throughout history in terms of leading to all these wonderful new technologies. And so why can't the military be a green innovator, right? Like, I think it's quite possible. The other thing, too, is in terms of efficiency, one thing that I wanted to underscore is my colleagues and I just recently did a time series analysis just focusing on the U.S. Department of Defense, looking at their overall energy consumption and military spending through time. And this is a happy takeaway. We found that there's statistical asymmetry in the effects of military spending on energy consumption, where a decrease in military spending has a much larger effect on decreasing direct energy consumption than an increase in military spending has on increasing energy consumption. And it's not trivial, like a 6% decrease in U.S. military spending could lead to an overall decrease in direct energy consumption of the U.S. Department of Defense that's on par with what Slovenia as a nation consumes an entire year. And Slovenia is not a trivial case. It's like at the median when you arrange nation states from low to high. So there's economies of scale dynamics, kind of getting into inertia and basic bookkeeping types of things that can have some short-run kind of benefits while we're looking for these long-term structural and innovative changes.
Tom Delianis, Wilfrid Laurier University. Thank you. This has been a really excellent panel, wonderful conversation. I have a question about some of your estimates. In this country and in other NATO countries, you've committed to 5% GDP spending in the future, but there's been quite, as you know, there's a lot of discussion about how, first of all, I don't think that we'll ever reach 5%, but a large portion of that will be investments in infrastructure development that has economic benefits beyond the military. Mm-hmm. How do you account for that or that dual use infrastructure development in your projections of future emissions? Specifically as it's attributed to the military, I guess.
Before anyone responds, can we take Bruno's question? Yeah, you haven't got a question.
I have more of a comment.
Okay, fine. We'll come back for your comment afterwards. Okay, carry on. Who would like to start? Lennard, are you going to?
Yeah, maybe I can start. Yeah, I mean it's a good question, of course, because we don't know how this additional money will be spent. Will it be spent on salaries, on pension schemes, or is it simply that the prices of military equipment have skyrocketed, that we basically spend now 3.5% buying the same equipment because it became because of inflation much more expensive? We don't know. Unfortunately, that is the situation where we are in, that we have to there are so many uncertainties. That's why at least what I've shown you is just one case of 3.5%. We also have 2.5%, 5%, and just to see the range of options. However, the conclusion still stands that the military emissions will eat up the remaining carbon budget unless we significantly are able to decarbonize.
And just a quick one on that in terms of, I guess, what's the 2 parts? One, how the 5.5% that I mentioned, so that is based on military spending and military size data from 2019. So that is sort of looking retrospectively. But also just a fundamental bottom line of all of this stuff is that the estimations around military emissions are messy, and a huge part of that is because we are working with terrible data and that all of these conversations would be significantly easier. Our modelling and our also reviewing of retrospectively would be significantly easier. We would have a much better grasp of the scale of the problem and the accuracy if we had better data. So.
Bruno?
Thanks, everyone. That was great. That's always fantastic. I don't have a question per se. I have multiple comments. It's a possibility or possibilities I'm throwing out there, not only to you, but everyone in the room, actually. Should have thought about it way before today, but I don't know why. Anyway, 3 related comments. First, Ellie, I think, it's only anecdotal evidence. It's my own experience, but I think there's more on climate change going on at NATO than appears to be going on because of the political context. It is slow moving. It's not enough, but I think it's picking up speed. Hopefully I'm right. I don't know if my other colleagues in the room would agree, but I like to be optimistic here, knowing what's going on at Casco, but also what's going on in Brussels, what's going on elsewhere. Picking up also while I was standing in line on Greg's comment about infrastructure, the future, or the impact of the energy transition on the military, basically, right? This is something me and Duncan have talked about for a year now, and I'm sure you're going to talk about in the next panel. We sent somewhat of a report to the Office of Chief Scientist at NATO on that issue, just raising questions. And in conversation, someone from the office told me, yeah, we have a NATO pipeline system I didn't know existed, and we don't know what to do with it now. So, just putting this out there, there's a NATO pipeline system in Europe to, I don't know, I guess supply NATO troops, and maybe Francois knows about it, and they don't know what the future of that is. And so that leads me to my intent here, which is to suggest for those who don't know, I'm a member of one of the STO. So, okay, sorry, I'll give a bit of context. NATO has the STO, that's the Science Technology Organization, which is basically a structure for scientific collaboration and a bit of science diplomacy, if you will. And long story short, the structures, they have different, they call them panels, which are basically divided or defined by topics. And I'm the Casco representative for the SAS panel, so that's the System Analysis Panel, which core objective is to support NATO decision-making. And so I'm throwing this out there because I would certainly, for those of you on the panel or in the room who want to actually engage with, let's say, other worlds, policy, but also all sorts of academics, because there's a bunch, it's actually quite interesting to see the sort of multiple background and diversity of people who come around the STO and on the SAS panel to collaborate. I would certainly, I think, if anyone here on that panel or elsewhere would like to try out that stuff, I would sponsor your project. And we have a Kinney, I cannot technically, because I'm just Casco, so I'm not a voting member of the panel, but obviously I work with the Kane representative who has voting powers, and there are others also from the Casco nations on the board who could do that. And I mean, it's just a possibility to engage with another crowd, but also to write something that becomes a sort of quote-unquote NATO report or scientific report, whatever. Yeah, there are all sorts of possibilities here that makes your points to NATO, to raise the flag about climate change. And I'm sure the UK representative would be a strong supporter as well. That's the first one I have in mind. So anyway, I'm just throwing that out there because, especially given your presentation, Greg, about the NATO scenarios, I think that's the sort of thing would be really interesting to NATO. And all these people who are trying, and the Casco, obviously, I'm talking about Casco here, but I apologize, but I'm sure Casco would support all of that, be very happy to support that sort of effort. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Any quick responses to any of that?
I have one, if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on the on your point, yeah, I have no doubt that there is work going on behind the scenes. I think what we're seeing is a language change, right? There is almost like a little bit of a self-censoring around climate that means that the work that is being done on climate isn't called climate. Extreme weather, perhaps, and things like this, which I think is understandable given the current context in terms of getting things done. There is also, however, a kind of flip side to that, where the civil society pushback on this topic, when I go to COP, I'm hearing more and more civil society organisations pointing to militaries and kind of questioning this. If that work isn't seen publicly as happening, and you're having a louder and louder civil society pushback, what does that mean for militaries in this, social license to operate type questions. Also, I mean, that's one level, but on another level of kind of joined up progress on this as well. So, for example, there is work going on this that I know of from within, say, the European Defence Agency has their consultation forum on sustainable energy, SEDSS, Sustainable Energy and Defence, something like that, who do really, like, they're doing very good work on this. But again, I think there is an element of kind of public facing that is necessary to push forward progress. I think a lot of this happening behind closed doors isn't massively going to help us at this point, definitely not to progress at the pace that we need. Oh.
Sorry, just...
Go on. We could also just chat about this later.
No, but it's important. It's sort of, you say behind doors, but it's nothing top secret. What I was team leader, some of you know a SAS 182 report. That's unclassified work. It's just basically academics getting together, writing a report. Tom was part of it. Others in the room were. And now it's called NATO report. It's not a NATO report. It's a report I coordinated basically with a whole bunch of people from all sorts of places. So it's not. We're not talking about this sort of behind doors thing. But what I wanted to say also is that despite what I've said, I'm fully aware there's a lot of inertia here too as well. The military or military and defense organization, as far as I'm concerned, are very conservative, and they change very slowly. And so you encounter that sort of inertia, and a lot of people have talked about cultural change yesterday too. So there's a lot of that needs to happen in terms of changing mindsets. But I think we've moved beyond, again, anecdotal evidence perhaps because I'm at the Casco and whatnot, but we've moved beyond having to convince people it matters. I think now it's just, okay, it matters, but what do we do about it? It's so big. It goes beyond the military, so that sort of thing. So that's where I think that sort of scientific collaboration is really important to sort of push for, okay, we get it now, so what do we do about it? I think that's where there's a lot to be done. That would be my point of view.
So Bruno, I'm just going to look to you because we are at the end of the time. We will have Sarah's comment and then a very brief response from Lennard, and then I think it's coffee time.
No, I'm sorry. It's definitely coffee time. But I'm going to save some things up because I've been scribbling furiously. I'm luckily going to be on the closing panel, and I've got lots of responses that I'll share. But I'd just say questions about how do we influence the strategic decision makers? How do we make sure that climate change is not off the agenda? I'm going to call for continued pressure from civil society to say, yeah, that's not okay. That we want to see climate being talked about openly. And I think that that's the role that civil society should continue to play, because that pressure from the outside makes it easier for people, some of us who are trying to work quietly on the inside, because that's the best way that we can work, for us to continue to do that work. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Sarah. Lennard, last word.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why sort of we are focusing on NATO is very simple, because NATO is very transparent and has data and has a policy. Whereas in other countries, there isn't much to going around on the climate change. So, and if NATO, and just as an example, if NATO sets a new standard for synthetic fuels for aviation, for example, that will be fantastic, and that will not only impact military emissions, but that probably can also influence civil aviation. So things are going slow. That's unfortunate, but if they happen, they will happen big.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lennard. And terrific panel, guys. Really enjoyed the presentations. Excellent, thought-provoking discussion. And I think it's set up the rest of the day really very nicely, given some of the discussions that we're going to be coming on to. So just finally, if everyone would like to join me in thanking our panelists.